Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history, Salem, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. On the morning of October 31st, 1901, the most expensive property transaction in Salem's recorded history was completed in absolute silence. The Bishop Mansion, a three-story colonial estate situated on Chestnut Street, overlooking the harbor, was sold for the unprecedented sum of $12,000. The buyer's identity remained sealed in county records that would later vanish entirely. What made this sale particularly unusual was not the price, but the speed with which it was conducted, and the fact that the Bishop family had seemingly disappeared 3 days prior to the transaction. The mansion had belonged to the Bishop family for over 2 centuries. Built in 1698 by merchant Thomas Bishop, it had housed 7 generations of one of Salem's most influential families. The Bishops controlled significant shipping interests and maintained extensive church connections throughout Essex County. Their influence extended from Boston Harbor to the lumber mills of New Hampshire. The property itself commanded an imposing presence on Chestnut Street, with its distinctive gambrel roof and massive stone chimneys that could be seen from the harbor. The front facade featured elaborate Georgian details that had been added during renovations in 1775, including hand-carved pilasters and a pediment over the main entrance that bore the family coat of arms. Yet, on October 28, 1901, every member of the immediate Bishop family had departed Salem without notice, leaving behind not only their ancestral home, but also their business interests, church positions, and social obligations. The circumstances surrounding their disappearance would confound investigators for decades and ultimately reveal a web of historical secrets that certain individuals were apparently willing to kill to protect. County records from that period, discovered in 1962 during a routine archive transfer, revealed that the sale had been arranged through a series of letters exchanged with a law firm in Boston. The correspondence, written on expensive letterhead and bearing official seals, suggested that the family had relocated to Europe for health reasons, though no ship manifests from Boston Harbor during that period contain any record of Bishop family members. More troubling was the discovery that the Boston law firm mentioned in the correspondence had never existed. The address provided in the letters corresponded to a vacant office building that had been unoccupied for over 6 months at the time the supposed legal negotiations were conducted. The mystery deepened when researchers found that all personal effects had been left behind in the mansion. According to the estate inventory prepared by the county assessor, a methodical man named Herbert Coolidge, who had served in that capacity for over 15 years, the house contained complete wardrobes, family portraits, business ledgers, and even prepared meals that had been left to spoil on the dining room table. Coolidge noted in his marginalia, written in his characteristic careful script, that the house felt as though its occupants had simply vanished mid-conversation, leaving everything exactly as it was at the moment of their departure. He specifically mentioned finding teacups still containing the remnants of what appeared to be afternoon tea, suggesting that whatever had prompted their departure had occurred with extraordinary suddenness. The inventory revealed a household that had been maintained with meticulous attention to detail. The dining room contained a complete set of Wedgwood china for 24 guests, arranged in precise order within mahogany cabinets that had been imported from England in 1847. The library housed over 2,000 volumes, including rare theological works, maritime law texts, and an extensive collection of genealogical materials that would later prove to be of crucial importance to understanding the family's fate. The parlor featured a grand piano manufactured by Steinway and Sons, along with sheet music for hymns, and classical pieces arranged as though someone had been in the midst of an evening's entertainment. More revealing were the personal items that had been left behind. Margaret Bishop's jewelry box contained valuable pieces that would have been among the first items packed for any planned departure. Jonathan Bishop's study contained sermon notes for services scheduled weeks into the future, along with correspondence regarding church business that suggested no intention of immediate departure. Samuel Bishop's office featured detailed shipping schedules extending through December 1901, with specific notations about cargo arrangements and passenger accommodations that indicated ongoing business commitments. Before the strange events of October 1901, the Bishop family had maintained a reputation for religious devotion and community involvement that spanned generations. Their prominence in Salem society was built on a foundation of careful cultivation of relationships with other influential families, strategic business partnerships, and unwavering commitment to the Congregational Church that had shaped the community's character since its founding. The family's social calendar, meticulously recorded in Margaret Bishop's personal diaries, reveals the extent to which they were integrated into every aspect of Salem's elite society. Reverend Jonathan Bishop served as assistant pastor at the First Church of Salem, a position he had held for 15 years after completing his theological studies at Harvard Divinity School. His sermons, preserved in the church archives, demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of contemporary theological debates and a particular interest in the relationship between historical events and divine providence. Several of his most well-regarded addresses dealt with the need for communities to confront the darker aspects of their past in order to achieve spiritual growth, themes that would later take on ominous significance in light of subsequent events. Jonathan's wife, Margaret, organized charitable functions for the Essex County Women's Christian Association and maintained correspondence with similar organizations throughout New England. Her letters, discovered among the family papers, reveal a woman of considerable intelligence and organizational skill who had created an extensive network of contacts among the wives and daughters of prominent families across the region. Margaret's charitable work focused particularly on providing assistance to families affected by industrial accidents and economic hardship, activities that brought her into contact with people from all levels of Salem society. Their household included 2 adult relatives who played crucial roles in the family's daily operations and social connections. Jonathan's brother Samuel, who managed the family's shipping interests, had established himself as one of Salem's most successful merchants through a combination of shrewd business sense and careful attention to the political developments that affected maritime trade. Samuel's ledgers reveal a complex network of business relationships that extended from the Caribbean islands to the lumber regions of Canada, with particular attention to opportunities created by the changing economic conditions of the early 20th century. Margaret's sister, Catherine, who had never married, served as the family's unofficial historian and had undertaken an extensive project to document the genealogies of prominent Salem families. Catherine's work, which had begun as a personal interest in family history, had evolved into a comprehensive research effort that involved examination of church records, court documents, and private family papers dating back to the colonial period. Her research had earned recognition from historical societies throughout New England, and she maintained correspondence with scholars at Harvard, Yale, and other prestigious institutions. The family's daily routine was well documented in Margaret Bishop's personal journals, leather-bound volumes covering the years 1895 through 1901 that were discovered decades later during renovation work. These detailed accounts reveal a household that functioned with clockwork precision, reflecting both the family's commitment to order and discipline, and their awareness of the social expectations that came with their prominent position in the community. Morning prayers occurred at 6 o'clock sharp in the family's private chapel, a small room on the second floor that had been consecrated by the church hierarchy in 1892. The chapel featured a simple altar adorned with fresh flowers that Catherine arranged each evening, along with family Bibles that had been passed down through generations. Following prayers, the family gathered for breakfast in the formal dining room, where conversation typically focused on the day's planned activities and discussion of current events affecting the community. Samuel departed for the docks by 7:30, traveling by carriage to the waterfront district, where the family maintained offices in a brick building that had been constructed specifically for their shipping operations. His work involved not only the management of cargo operations, but also careful attention to the political and economic factors that could affect maritime commerce. Samuel's correspondence reveals his particular concern with labor relations in the shipping industry and his efforts to maintain good relationships with both workers and other business owners. Jonathan spent his mornings in the library, preparing sermons and conducting research for various theological projects he had undertaken. His study habits were methodical and intensive, involving careful examination of biblical texts in their original languages, as well as study of contemporary theological scholarship. Jonathan maintained extensive notes on his readings, organized in a system that allowed him to quickly locate specific references and quotations for use in his sermons and other writings. Margaret spent her mornings tending to correspondence and household management, activities that required considerable skill and attention to detail. Her letters reveal the complexity of maintaining a prominent household in early 20th century New England, involving coordination with domestic staff, management of social obligations, and careful attention to the political and economic factors that could affect the family's position in the community. Margaret's household account books show meticulous attention to expenses and careful planning for entertainment and charitable activities. Catherine maintained extensive genealogical records in what the family called the Heritage Room, a large chamber on the third floor that had been converted into a research facility complete with filing cabinets, reference books, and work tables for examining documents. Catherine's research methods were sophisticated and thorough, involving cross-referencing multiple sources to verify information and careful attention to discrepancies that might indicate errors or deliberate falsifications in official records. The mansion itself reflected the family's status and religious devotion through its architectural features and interior arrangements. The ground floor featured a formal parlor with imported furnishings from England, including chairs upholstered in silk fabric that had been specially ordered from London merchants. The walls were adorned with portraits of family ancestors painted by prominent artists of their respective periods that served both decorative and commemorative purposes. The parlor's most striking feature was a large marble fireplace surrounded by carved wooden panels that depicted biblical scenes. The dining room was capable of seating 16 guests at a table crafted from mahogany imported from the West Indies, surrounded by chairs that matched the parlor furniture in both style and quality. The room's windows provided views of the harbor that allowed diners to observe the comings and goings of ships that were often connected to the family's business interests. Silver serving pieces, many bearing the family crest, were displayed in cabinets that had been built specifically to accommodate the collection that had been assembled over multiple generations. The library contained over 2,000 volumes organized according to a system that Catherine had developed based on her research needs and the family's intellectual interests. The collection included rare theological works acquired during Jonathan's studies, maritime law texts that Samuel used for business purposes, and an extensive collection of genealogical materials that reflected Catherine's research activities. Many of the books contained margin notes and inserted papers that revealed the intensive study habits of family members. The second floor housed the family's private quarters, including bedchambers that had been furnished with careful attention to both comfort and propriety. Jonathan and Margaret's master bedroom featured a four-poster bed crafted by local artisans, along with wardrobes that contained clothing appropriate for both daily activities and formal social occasions. Samuel's room reflected his bachelor status and business interests, with a desk for conducting correspondence and shelves containing books related to shipping and commerce. Catherine's room had been modified to accommodate her research activities, with additional shelving for books and files related to her genealogical work. Her personal correspondence reveals that she often worked late into the evening using oil lamps to illuminate documents she was examining or copying. The room also contained a small safe where she stored the most sensitive material she had discovered during her research. The third floor had been converted into additional bedchambers for guests and storage rooms for the family's extensive collection of documents and artifacts relating to Salem's history. These rooms contained furniture and household items that had been accumulated over multiple generations, along with business records and personal papers that documented the family's activities and relationships. Catherine had organized much of this material according to her research needs, creating a comprehensive archive of information about Salem's prominent families. Neighbors described the Bishop household as quiet but welcoming, with social activities that reflected both the family's religious convictions and their awareness of community expectations. The family regularly hosted dinner parties for prominent members of Salem's religious and business communities, events that were carefully planned to maintain and strengthen important relationships. Margaret's journals reveal that these gatherings followed strict protocols, with specific seating arrangements that reflected both social hierarchy and the family's careful attention to maintaining their reputation within the community. The family's religious observances extended beyond Sunday services and private chapel devotions to include regular participation in church committees and charitable activities. Jonathan served on the church council that made decisions about doctrine and community outreach, while Margaret organized fundraising activities for missions and local charitable causes. Samuel contributed his business expertise to church financial management, and Catherine provided historical research for various church publications and commemorative projects. Evening prayers were conducted in the parlor each night at 8 o'clock, with family members gathering for readings from Scripture and discussion of spiritual matters. Margaret's journals reveal that these sessions often included consideration of current events and community concerns from a religious perspective, with particular attention to the family's responsibilities as prominent community members. The prayers concluded with a period of silent reflection that Margaret described as essential for spiritual growth and family unity. The family maintained periods of silent reflection that Margaret referred to in her journals as listening hours, during which all conversation was forbidden throughout the house for exactly 60 minutes, beginning at sunset. These observances, which occurred 3 evenings per week, were intended to create opportunities for spiritual contemplation and awareness of divine presence. During these periods, family members were expected to engage in private prayer, meditation, or reading of religious texts. The Bishop family's social connections extended throughout Essex County and into Boston's prominent religious and business circles. Their correspondence reveals relationships with families who controlled major shipping enterprises, textile mills, and financial institutions throughout New England. These relationships were maintained through regular visits, shared business interests, and mutual participation in religious and charitable activities that strengthened both personal bonds and economic partnerships. Margaret's charitable work brought the family into contact with a broader cross-section of society, including working families affected by industrial accidents and economic hardship. Her correspondence reveals genuine concern for the welfare of less fortunate community members, along with a sophisticated understanding of the economic and political factors that contributed to social problems. Margaret's activities in this area were supported by contributions from other prominent families who valued both the charitable work itself and the positive reputation it created for their community. The first indication that something had changed in the Bishop household appeared in Margaret's journal entry for October 15, 1901. Her typically detailed daily accounts, which had provided comprehensive records of family activities, social engagements, and household management for over 6 years, became increasingly sparse and unfocused. The elegant script that had characterized her earlier entries appeared shaky and uncertain, suggesting either physical illness or emotional distress that affected her ability to maintain her usual standards of documentation. More significantly, her usual practice of recording the family's evening prayers and reading sessions ceased entirely after October 20th, despite the fact that these activities had been among the most important aspects of daily life for the Bishop household. The absence of these records was particularly troubling because Margaret had previously described these spiritual observances as essential elements of family life that provided both structure and meaning to their daily routine. Samuel Bishop's business ledgers, maintained with meticulous care for over a decade, showed similar irregularities during this period. His final entries, dated October 23rd, consisted of incomplete shipping schedules and fragmentary notes about cargo manifests that made little sense within the context of his usual business practices. Several pages appeared to have been torn from the ledger, leaving gaps in the chronological record that suggested either careless handling or deliberate concealment of information. The remaining entries contained cryptic references to delayed departures and revised passenger accommodations that made no sense within the context of the family's shipping business, which typically dealt with cargo transport rather than passenger services. Samuel's correspondence with business partners during this period shows increasing concern about unspecified problems that were affecting his ability to maintain normal operations, though he provided no details about the nature of these difficulties. The domestic staff noticed changes as well, though their observations were initially dismissed as natural variations in family routine. According to testimony provided to county officials in 1902, the household cook, Mary O'Sullivan, observed that the family had stopped taking their meals in the dining room beginning October 22nd. Instead, they requested that food be left outside their respective bedchamber doors, a practice that was unprecedented in her 15 years of service with the family. When Mary inquired about this change in routine, Margaret Bishop explained that the family was observing a period of religious fasting that required isolation and silence. This explanation was accepted by the domestic staff, particularly given the family's reputation for unconventional religious observances, but several staff members later reported that the explanation seemed inconsistent with other aspects of the family's behavior during this period. More troubling was the disappearance of the family's evening social hours. For years, the bishops had maintained an open-door policy on Wednesday evenings, when members of the congregation could visit for informal discussions about religious matters or community concerns. These gatherings had been an important part of Salem's religious community life, providing opportunities for people to seek guidance and support from one of the community's most respected families. These weekly gatherings ceased without explanation after October 15th, despite the fact that several parishioners arrived at the customary time and found the house locked and apparently empty. Church records indicate that Jonathan had failed to provide advance notice of this change, which was inconsistent with his usual practice of careful communication about any modifications to established routines. The sudden termination of these social gatherings created confusion and concern within the religious community. The family's isolation became more pronounced as October progressed, with various indicators suggesting that they were deliberately avoiding contact with the outside world. The regular delivery of ice for the household's cold storage was canceled without explanation, forcing the domestic staff to make alternative arrangements for food preservation. Mail began accumulating in the front hall, unopened and untouched, despite the fact that the family typically maintained extensive correspondence with business associates and social contacts. Samuel ceased appearing at the shipping office, leaving his business partner, Thomas Hartwell, to manage all operations alone. Hartwell later testified that his attempts to visit the Bishop mansion during this period were unsuccessful, as no one responded to his knocking, despite clear evidence that the family was present inside. Lights could be seen moving through the house during evening hours, and the domestic staff reported that food left outside bedchamber doors was consistently consumed, indicating that the family members were alive and present but deliberately avoiding contact with visitors. The transformation of the Bishop family's behavior reached its culmination during the final week of October, when their isolation became so complete that even essential services were disrupted. On October 24th, Margaret Bishop sent a brief note to her sister in Boston, stating only that the family would be traveling extensively for an indefinite period and that all correspondence should be held until further notice. This message, preserved in her sister's effects and later provided to investigators, was the last known communication from any member of the Bishop family. The brevity and vagueness of this final communication was particularly troubling because Margaret had previously maintained regular and detailed correspondence with family members and friends throughout New England. Her letters typically provided comprehensive accounts of family activities and community events, along with thoughtful commentary on religious and social matters. The stark contrast between her usual communication style and this final message suggested either extreme emotional distress or external pressure that prevented normal correspondence. During these same days, neighbors reported hearing sounds from within the mansion that seemed inconsistent with normal household activities. Mrs. Elizabeth Corey, who lived in the adjacent property and had been friendly with the Bishop family for over 20 years, told county officials that she had observed lights moving through the house at unusual hours, particularly in the third-floor windows where the family storage rooms were located. She described the lights as purposeful but erratic, suggesting that someone was searching for specific items among the family's possessions. Mrs. Corey's observations were particularly significant because her property shared a fence line with the Bishop estate, providing her with clear views of the mansion's eastern facade and opportunities to observe activities that might not be visible from the street. Her testimony indicated that the unusual lighting patterns had begun around October 20th and continued until the night of October 27th, suggesting that whatever activities were taking place in the house had required several days to complete. More concerning were the sounds that emerged from the mansion during the early morning hours. Multiple neighbors reported hearing what they described as furniture being moved or heavy objects being dragged across the floors. These disturbances typically began around 3 o'clock in the morning and continued until dawn, suggesting that the family was engaged in activities that they preferred to conduct when they were least likely to be observed by neighbors or passers-by. The sounds were particularly puzzling because they seemed to involve the movement of large objects between different floors of the house, requiring coordination and physical effort that seemed inconsistent with the family's apparent desire for isolation and quiet. Several neighbors commented that the sounds suggested either extensive rearrangement of household furnishings or preparation for some kind of departure, though no moving wagons or other transportation equipment was observed at the property. When these disturbances were reported to local authorities, a constable visited the property on October 26th, but received no response to his inquiries. The constable, William Murphy, had served in that capacity for over 10 years and was familiar with the Bishop family through various community interactions. His report to county officials indicated that while the house showed clear signs of occupancy, including lights in various windows and smoke from the chimneys, no one responded to repeated knocking at both the front and rear entrances. Murphy's report also noted that the grounds around the house showed signs of recent activity, including areas where soil had been disturbed and paths through the garden that suggested regular movement between the house and the property's more remote areas. These observations were significant because they indicated that the family's isolation had not prevented them from engaging in activities that required them to leave the house, raising questions about why they had refused to respond to visitors. The family's apparent preparation for departure was conducted in complete secrecy, with no obvious signs of the logistics that would typically be required for a permanent relocation. No moving wagons were observed at the property, despite the fact that the house had been left fully furnished. No travel arrangements were made with any of the local transportation companies that typically handled such logistics for Salem's prominent families. Most mysteriously, the family's financial affairs remained completely unchanged right up until their disappearance, with no liquidation of assets or transfer of business responsibilities that would typically accompany a permanent relocation. Thomas Hartwell's business records from this period provide detailed documentation of the family's shipping interests during the weeks leading up to their disappearance. His ledgers show that cargo operations continued normally with scheduled shipments arriving and departing, according to established patterns. Samuel Bishop's absence from daily operations was initially explained to customers and business partners as temporary illness, but Hartwell's private notes reveal his growing concern about the lack of communication from his partner. Most significantly, the family's financial accounts showed no unusual activity during the weeks preceding their disappearance. Bank records from this period, examined during subsequent investigations, revealed that the family had maintained their usual patterns of deposits and withdrawals related to business operations and household expenses. No large cash withdrawals or transfers of funds were recorded, suggesting that either their departure was genuinely spontaneous or they had made financial arrangements through channels that did not involve their usual banking relationships. On the morning of October 28th, Mary O'Sullivan arrived for her customary work duties and found the mansion completely empty. All doors had been left unlocked, which was unprecedented in her experience with the family, who had always been careful about security, given their prominent position in the community and the valuable possessions contained in their home. The unlocked doors suggested either extreme haste in their departure or a deliberate decision to facilitate access by unknown individuals. Every room appeared exactly as it had been the previous evening when she departed, with no signs of disturbance or hasty packing that might indicate a sudden departure. The breakfast table had been set for 4 people, with fresh bread and preserves arranged as though the family had been expected to arrive at any moment. The precision of these preparations suggested that whatever had prompted their departure had occurred after the evening meal but before breakfast, during a period when the domestic staff was not present to observe their activities. Their bedchambers showed signs of recent occupancy, with beds unmade and personal items scattered about in patterns that suggested normal nighttime routines. Clothing had been laid out for the following day, and personal hygiene items remained in their usual places, indicating that the family had prepared for sleep and anticipated resuming normal activities the following morning. All clothing and personal effects remained in their proper places, with no evidence of packing or selection of items for travel. Most disturbing was the discovery that the family's private papers had been systematically removed from the house. Jonathan's sermon notes, Margaret's journals covering the final 2 weeks of October, Samuel's business correspondence, and Catherine's genealogical research had all vanished, leaving carefully organized gaps in collections that had previously been maintained with meticulous attention to detail. The selective nature of these removals suggested that whoever was responsible had specific knowledge of what documents might be significant. Only earlier materials remained, creating gaps in the documentary record that would prove significant to later investigators. The pattern of missing documents suggested that the removals had been conducted by someone familiar with the family's filing systems and research activities, as the gaps appeared in precisely those areas that would contain the most sensitive or recent information. The Heritage Room, where Catherine had maintained the family's historical records, appeared to have been carefully searched, with certain files removed, while others were left undisturbed. The selective nature of these removals suggested that whoever had conducted the search had specific knowledge of Catherine's research activities and had targeted particular aspects of her work while leaving other materials untouched. The immediate response to the family's disappearance reflected the social dynamics of early 20th century Salem, where the sudden absence of such prominent community members created both practical and social disruptions that demanded explanation. As pillars of the religious community and major contributors to local business and charitable activities, the bishop's sudden absence left gaps in various organizations and institutions that required immediate attention from other community leaders. Reverend Henry Whitmore, the senior pastor at First Church, initially suggested that the family had undertaken a religious pilgrimage that required secrecy for spiritual reasons. This explanation was readily accepted by most church members, particularly given the Bishop family's reputation for unconventional religious observances and their known interest in deepening their spiritual understanding through intensive study and prayer. The pilgrimage explanation also provided a framework for understanding the family's apparent desire for secrecy and their failure to provide advance notice of their departure. Business concerns were addressed through the intervention of Thomas Hartwell, Samuel's partner, who assumed full control of the shipping operations with the understanding that this arrangement was temporary pending the family's return. Hartwell maintained detailed records of all business activities during this period, expecting to provide a full accounting upon their return. His meticulous documentation would later prove valuable to investigators, as it established that the Bishop family's financial interests continued to generate income throughout their absence, with all proceeds being held in trust accounts. The legal aspects of the property sale were handled with remarkable efficiency, considering the complex nature of such transactions in early 20th century Massachusetts. Within 3 days of the family's disappearance, representatives of the mysterious Boston law firm arrived in Salem with complete documentation for the property transfer, including deeds, title searches, and financial arrangements that appeared to have been prepared well in advance of the actual sale. County officials, eager to avoid the complications associated with abandoned property and the potential legal challenges that might arise from an unclear ownership situation, processed the sale without extensive verification of the legal authority behind the transaction. The speed with which these arrangements were completed suggested a level of planning and preparation that contradicted the apparent suddenness of the family's departure. The efficiency of the legal proceedings was particularly notable because property transfers involving such valuable estates typically required weeks or months of legal preparation, document verification, and coordination between multiple parties. The fact that all necessary paperwork was available immediately upon the family's disappearance suggested either remarkable foresight in legal planning or the involvement of individuals with extensive knowledge of property law and access to appropriate legal resources. Community response varied according to social position and relationship with the family, reflecting the complex social dynamics of Salem's stratified society. Members of Salem's business community expressed concern about the stability of the shipping enterprise and the potential impact on local commerce if the family's departure proved to be permanent. The Bishop family's shipping operations were significant enough to affect employment and economic activity throughout the waterfront district, making their continuation under Hartwell's management a matter of community-wide interest. Religious community members were divided between those who accepted the pilgrimage explanation and others who found the secrecy troubling, in light of the family's previous openness about their spiritual activities. Some congregation members questioned why a religious pilgrimage would require such complete secrecy, particularly given Jonathan's pastoral responsibilities and the family's previous willingness to discuss their spiritual growth with other church members. Working-class residents, including the Bishop family's domestic staff and individuals who had benefited from Margaret's charitable activities, were more direct in their suspicions that something unfortunate had befallen the family. Their concerns were based on practical knowledge of the family's habits and character, leading them to conclude that the sudden departure was inconsistent with the predictable patterns that had characterized the family's behavior for many years. The most significant early investigation was conducted by Catherine's correspondence partner, Dr. Harold Pemberton, a professor of history at Harvard University who had been collaborating with her on a study of colonial-era church records. Dr. Pemberton had developed a close working relationship with Catherine over several years of scholarly correspondence, making him one of the few people outside Salem who had detailed knowledge of her research activities and personal circumstances. When Catherine failed to respond to his letters, which was unprecedented in their long correspondence, Dr. Pemberton traveled to Salem in November 1901 to investigate personally. His subsequent report to university authorities described finding systematic gaps in the historical record that suggest deliberate concealment rather than accidental loss, indicating that Catherine's research materials had been removed in a way that targeted specific types of information while leaving other materials untouched. Dr. Pemberton's academic training and objective perspective allowed him to identify patterns in the missing materials that local investigators might have overlooked. His analysis suggested that whoever had removed Catherine's research papers had possessed sophisticated knowledge of genealogical research methods and historical documentation, enabling them to identify and remove precisely those materials that might be most damaging if made public. As autumn turned to winter, the empty mansion became a source of increasing speculation among Salem residents. The property's prominent location on Chestnut Street ensured that its vacant condition was constantly visible to neighbors and passers-by, creating ongoing reminders of the mysterious circumstances surrounding the family's disappearance. The mansion's distinctive architecture and well-maintained grounds made it one of Salem's most recognizable landmarks, amplifying the impact of its empty windows and silent rooms. The new owners, who remained anonymous despite repeated inquiries from neighbors and local officials, made no apparent plans for occupancy or renovation. The property was maintained by a caretaking service hired through the same mysterious Boston law firm that had arranged the original purchase, but these arrangements involved only basic maintenance of the grounds and building exterior. The mansion's interior remained exactly as the Bishop family had left it, creating what neighbors described as an unsettling sense of suspended time. The caretaking arrangements were particularly puzzling because they involved significant ongoing expenses without any apparent benefit to the anonymous owners. The costs of maintaining such a large property, including groundskeeping, basic repairs, and security measures, would typically motivate owners to either occupy the property themselves or arrange for rental income through tenants. The absence of either approach suggested that the new owners had motivations beyond normal economic considerations. Local speculation about the new owner's identity and intentions became increasingly elaborate as months passed without any clarification of their plans for the property. Some residents suggested that the buyers were wealthy individuals from Boston or New York who intended to use the mansion as a seasonal residence, while others theorized that the property had been purchased for investment purposes by individuals who were waiting for real estate values to appreciate before reselling. More sinister theories emerged among residents who had been particularly close to the Bishop family and found the official explanations for their departure unconvincing. These individuals suggested that the property sale had been arranged to conceal evidence of whatever had actually happened to the family, with the anonymous buyers serving as a cover for individuals who had reason to prevent investigation of the circumstances surrounding the disappearance. The first systematic attempt to understand what had happened to the Bishop family was undertaken in 1903 by Detective Inspector Robert Morrison of the Massachusetts State Police. Morrison's investigation was prompted by complaints from other members of the Bishop extended family who had become concerned about the lack of communication and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the property sale. His assignment to the case reflected growing official concern that the disappearance might involve criminal activity rather than voluntary departure. Morrison's reputation as a thorough and objective investigator made him an appropriate choice for examining a case that involved prominent community members and potentially sensitive political considerations. His previous work had included investigation of financial crimes and missing persons cases involving wealthy families, providing him with experience in navigating the social and legal complexities that could arise when investigating the activities of prominent individuals. Morrison's preliminary report, preserved in state police archives until 1965, when it was discovered during a reorganization of old case files, revealed significant irregularities in the official version of events that had been accepted by local authorities. His systematic approach to evidence gathering and witness interviews uncovered discrepancies that suggested the Bishop family's disappearance had been carefully planned and executed by individuals with extensive knowledge of legal and financial procedures. Morrison's investigation focused initially on the documentation surrounding the property sale, applying professional skepticism to legal procedures that local officials had accepted without extensive verification. His attempts to contact the Boston law firm responsible for the transaction led to the discovery that the business address provided in county records corresponded to a vacant office building that had been unoccupied for over 6 months at the time of the sale. Further investigation revealed that the letterhead used in the correspondence contained subtle errors in legal terminology that suggested the documents had been prepared by someone unfamiliar with proper legal procedures. Morrison's consultation with legal experts confirmed that while the documents appeared official and contained appropriate seals and signatures, they included language and formatting that would not have been used by legitimate legal professionals of that period. The detective's analysis of the financial aspects of the property transaction revealed additional irregularities that raised questions about the legitimacy of the entire arrangement. The speed with which payment had been arranged and the lack of typical verification procedures suggested that the transaction had been designed to avoid the scrutiny that would normally accompany such a significant real estate transfer. More troubling was Morrison's discovery that several key witnesses to the family's final days had left Salem shortly after the disappearance, removing themselves from the reach of potential investigation. Mary O'Sullivan, the cook, had departed for Ireland within 2 weeks of finding the empty mansion, despite having lived in Salem for over 15 years and having no previously expressed intention of returning to her homeland. Her sudden departure was particularly significant because she had been the person most likely to have observed the family's activities during their final days. The family's gardener, William Thornton, had similarly relocated to distant relatives in Vermont, abandoning his established landscaping business in Salem without making arrangements for the continuation of services to his other clients. Thornton's departure was especially puzzling because he had recently invested in new equipment and had contracted for services extending well into the following year, suggesting that his decision to leave had been made suddenly and without regard for financial consequences. Morrison's interviews with remaining neighbors and business associates revealed a pattern of small but significant inconsistencies in their recollections of the Bishop family's final weeks. Several residents mentioned seeing family members during the period when the household staff reported that the family was maintaining strict isolation. These sightings, however, involved encounters that the witnesses described as brief and strange, suggesting that something about the family's behavior during this period had left lasting impressions of unease. The witnesses who reported these encounters described family members who appeared distracted and anxious, quite different from their usual demeanor in social situations. Several people mentioned that the family members they encountered seemed reluctant to engage in normal conversation and appeared eager to end their interactions as quickly as possible. These behavioral changes were particularly notable because the Bishop family had previously been known for their graciousness and willingness to spend time in conversation with neighbors and acquaintances. The detectives' most significant discovery involved the family's financial records, which revealed patterns that contradicted the apparent spontaneity of their departure. While the shipping business continued to operate normally under Hartwell's management, Morrison found evidence that substantial sums had been withdrawn from the family's personal banking accounts during the weeks preceding their disappearance. These withdrawals, totaling over $8,000, represented a significant portion of the family's liquid assets and had been conducted through a series of bank drafts that required signatures from multiple family members. The coordination necessary for these transactions contradicted the apparent suddenness of the family's departure and suggested that their disappearance had been planned well in advance. The pattern of withdrawals indicated careful preparation for an extended absence, with funds being converted to portable forms that could be easily transported and used in locations where the family's usual banking relationships would not be available. Morrison's analysis of the withdrawal patterns revealed that the transactions had been conducted at different banks and on different dates, suggesting a deliberate effort to avoid attracting attention from financial institutions that might question unusual activity in the accounts. The use of multiple locations and the spacing of transactions over several weeks indicated sophisticated understanding of banking procedures and awareness of the need to avoid triggering investigative interest from financial authorities. Morrison's investigation was curtailed in early 1904 due to budget constraints and the lack of evidence suggesting criminal activity. His final report concluded that while the circumstances of the Bishop family's disappearance were unusual, they were not necessarily indicative of wrongdoing. The detective recommended that the case remain open pending the discovery of additional evidence, but acknowledged that without cooperation from the mysterious new property owners or contact with the missing family members, further investigation would be difficult to justify. The termination of Morrison's investigation reflected both practical limitations on law enforcement resources and the political considerations that affected official response to cases involving prominent families. Local officials were reluctant to pursue extensive investigation without clear evidence of criminal activity, particularly when such efforts might damage the reputation of a community that depended on maintaining an image of stability and respectability to support its economic interests. The years following the official conclusion of Morrison's investigation saw sporadic attempts by journalists and amateur investigators to uncover the truth about the Bishop family's fate. These efforts were hampered by the continued anonymity of the mansion's new owners and the apparent disappearance of key documentary evidence from various official repositories. Several journalists attempted to trace the origins of the mysterious Boston law firm, but their inquiries consistently led to dead ends and non-existent addresses. Amateur investigators, including members of historical societies and genealogical researchers who had known Catherine Bishop's work, attempted to reconstruct her research activities in hopes of understanding what might have motivated the family's disappearance. These efforts were frustrated by the systematic removal of her most recent materials and the lack of access to the mansion where much of her work had been conducted. By 1910, public interest in the case had largely faded, though it remained a topic of occasional speculation among Salem's older residents, who had known the family personally. The passage of time had gradually reduced the number of people with direct knowledge of the family's activities and character, making it increasingly difficult for investigators to gather reliable information about the circumstances surrounding their disappearance. The first breakthrough in understanding what had happened to the Bishop family came in 1962, when extensive renovations were undertaken at the mansion by its latest owners, who had purchased the property through yet another series of anonymous transactions. The renovation work was prompted by structural concerns that had developed over the decades of minimal maintenance, requiring extensive examination of the building's interior systems and architectural features. During the renovation work, construction crews discovered a hidden room behind the mansion's main library that had been sealed sometime in late 1901. The room was accessible through a concealed door in the library's paneling that had been so expertly disguised that it had gone unnoticed by previous occupants and caretakers. The existence of this hidden space suggested that the mansion's original designers had anticipated the need for secure storage of sensitive materials. The hidden room contained an extraordinary collection of documents, personal effects, and evidence that shed new light on the family's disappearance. The room appeared to have served as Catherine Bishop's private study, though its existence had never been mentioned in any of the family's surviving papers or in the accounts provided by domestic staff. The concealment of this space suggested that Catherine had been engaged in research activities that required secrecy, even from other family members. The room contained her complete genealogical research, including materials that documented not only the Bishop family history but also detailed investigations into the backgrounds of prominent Salem families dating back to the colonial period. The scope and detail of these materials revealed that Catherine's research had extended far beyond casual interest in family history to encompass systematic investigation of the social and political relationships that had shaped Salem's development over 2 centuries. More significantly, the room contained Catherine's private journals covering the period from 1890 through 1901, providing the first complete account of the family's final months. These journals revealed aspects of the family's experiences that had been entirely absent from the materials previously available to investigators, including detailed descriptions of threats and intimidation that had gradually escalated during the months preceding their disappearance. Catherine's journals revealed that the Bishop family had become convinced that they were being systematically stalked and threatened by individuals connected to historical events that they had uncovered through their genealogical research. The family's investigation into their own ancestry had led them to discover documentary evidence of their ancestors' involvement in activities during the Salem witch trials that contradicted the family's carefully maintained reputation for religious orthodoxy. The historical documents that Catherine had discovered painted a picture of Bishop family ancestors who had been active participants in the social and economic manipulation that had characterized the witch trial period. Rather than being innocent victims or principled opponents of the hysteria, the Bishop family's 17th century ancestors had apparently used the accusations and trials as opportunities to acquire property and eliminate business competition, working in coordination with other prominent families to target specific individuals whose assets they coveted. More troubling, Catherine's research had found evidence that suggested other prominent Salem families were aware of these historical connections and were using them for purposes of manipulation and control in contemporary business and social relationships. Her journals described discovering a complex web of mutual knowledge about historical crimes and improprieties that created a system of social control based on the threat of exposure. The journals described a complex web of relationships among Salem's elite families that involved the use of historical secrets as instruments of social and economic pressure. Catherine's research had revealed that many of the town's most respected religious and business leaders maintained private knowledge of their family's controversial pasts, and that this information was being used to influence contemporary business dealings, church appointments, and social arrangements. The system that Catherine had uncovered involved multiple families who possessed compromising information about each other's ancestors, creating a network of mutual intimidation that ensured cooperation and prevented any individual family from exposing others without risking exposure themselves. This arrangement had apparently maintained stability for decades, with each family understanding that their continued prosperity and social position depended on maintaining the secrecy that protected all participants. The Bishop family's discovery of this system had placed them in a dangerous position, as their research had given them access to information that could destabilize the entire network. Catherine's journals described growing awareness that their knowledge made them a threat that other families would need to eliminate, either through intimidation into silence or through more direct means. According to Catherine's final entries, the family had spent the summer of 1901 attempting to extricate themselves from this web of mutual intimidation without triggering the exposure of their own historical connections. These efforts had involved careful negotiations with representatives of other families, as the bishops sought to find a way to abandon their research without creating suspicion about their motives or their level of knowledge about others' secrets. These efforts had failed when it became clear that their research had uncovered information that certain individuals were determined to keep suppressed regardless of the consequences. Catherine's journals described increasing pressure from anonymous sources who demanded that the family surrender all their research materials and cease their genealogical activities entirely. When the family refused these demands, the pressure had escalated to include threats against their physical safety and their position in the community. The family's decision to disappear was presented in the journals as a carefully planned escape from what Catherine described as an impossible situation that threatened both their physical safety and their social survival. The journals revealed that the family had developed contingency plans for departure as early as summer 1901, including arrangements for transferring their assets and establishing new identities in locations where they would not be recognized. The most revealing documents in the hidden room were a series of letters exchanged between Catherine and unknown correspondents who appeared to represent the interests of other prominent families. These letters, written in carefully coded language that referenced historical events and genealogical research, detailed negotiations over the disposition of historical documents and the terms under which various family secrets might be kept confidential. The correspondence suggested that the Bishop family had been offered significant financial incentives to abandon their research and relocate permanently outside of Massachusetts. The initial offers had been presented as opportunities for the family to pursue their interests in locations where they would have access to different historical materials, but the coded language made clear that the true purpose was to remove them from Salem and prevent further investigation of local family histories. As negotiations had continued, the tone of the correspondence had become increasingly threatening, with references to the consequences that might befall families who failed to maintain appropriate discretion about historical matters. The letters made veiled references to other families who had faced difficulties after becoming too interested in genealogical research, suggesting that the Bishop family's situation was not unique. The final letter in this series, dated October 25, 1901, indicated that negotiations had broken down and that the family was being given 72 hours to comply with demands for the surrender of all their historical research materials. The ultimatum was presented in language that left no doubt about the consequences of non-compliance, though the specific threats were carefully disguised through references to historical events and religious concepts. Catherine's response draft copies of which were found among her papers, indicated that the family had decided to implement what she referred to as the departure protocol, suggesting that their disappearance had been planned as a contingency measure well in advance of the final crisis. Her draft letters revealed detailed planning for their disappearance, including arrangements for disposing of their property and establishing new lives under different identities. The revelation of these documents in 1962 prompted a new investigation by Dr. Richard Kellner, a historian specializing in post-colonial New England social structures. Dr. Kellner's research, conducted between 1963 and 1968, involved extensive analysis of the Bishop family's historical discoveries and attempts to verify their claims about the manipulation of genealogical information by Salem's elite families. Dr. Kellner's academic credentials and institutional support provided him with access to historical materials and archives that had been unavailable to previous investigators. His systematic approach to verifying Catherine Bishop's research involved cross-referencing her findings with independent sources and examining the broader patterns of social and economic relationships that had characterized Salem's development during the colonial and post-colonial periods. Dr. Kellner's findings, published in a limited circulation academic journal in 1969, confirmed many of Catherine's assertions about the existence of informal networks based on shared historical vulnerabilities. His research revealed that the social dynamics she had described were consistent with known patterns of elite family relationships in other New England communities, lending credibility to her specific claims about Salem. Dr. Kellner's investigation revealed that the Bishop family's research had uncovered evidence of systematic collaboration between certain prominent families during the witch trials that went far beyond what was acknowledged in official historical records. This collaboration had involved the strategic targeting of specific individuals for accusations of witchcraft, with the goal of acquiring their property and eliminating business competition. The families involved had maintained detailed records of these activities, apparently as insurance against potential exposure by other participants. These records, which Catherine had discovered through careful examination of family papers and church documents, provided evidence of coordination and planning that transformed the witch trials from episodes of religious hysteria into calculated campaigns of economic manipulation. Dr. Kellner's analysis of these historical patterns revealed that the witch trials had served multiple purposes for the families involved, providing opportunities not only for immediate economic gain through property acquisition, but also for establishing long-term control over community resources and social relationships. The families that had participated in these activities had used their shared knowledge of the crimes to maintain unity and prevent defection from their informal alliance. More significantly, Dr. Kellner found evidence that this system of mutual intimidation had continued into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with descendants of the original conspirators using knowledge of their family's shared history to maintain control over business and political opportunities in Salem and the surrounding region. The system had evolved over time, but its essential characteristics remained unchanged. Cooperation based on shared vulnerability and control, maintained through the threat of mutual exposure. The Bishop family's genealogical research had threatened this system by creating a comprehensive documentary record that could have exposed the entire network of historical and contemporary manipulation. Catherine's systematic approach to research and her connections with academic historians had created the possibility that their findings might be published and made available to researchers who could verify and expand upon their discoveries. Dr. Kellner's attempts to trace what had happened to the Bishop family after their disappearance were unsuccessful, though he found suggestive evidence that they had relocated to a remote area of northern New Hampshire under assumed names. Bank records from 1902 and 1903 showed regular transfers of funds from accounts associated with the Bishop shipping business to a small private bank in a town near the Canadian border. These transfers continued for approximately 2 years before ceasing entirely, suggesting that the family had either died or moved beyond the reach of American financial institutions. The pattern of transfers indicated that the family had maintained access to their assets for a significant period after their disappearance, supporting the theory that their departure had been voluntary and carefully planned rather than the result of violence or kidnapping. The location of the bank that received these transfers was significant because the town was located in a region known for providing refuge to individuals seeking to escape legal or social difficulties in more populated areas. The area's remoteness and the limited presence of law enforcement made it an appropriate destination for people who needed to establish new identities and avoid contact with authorities who might be searching for them. The most troubling aspect of Dr. Kellner's research was his discovery that several other Salem families had disappeared under similar circumstances during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In each case, the disappeared families had been involved in genealogical or historical research that potentially threatened the carefully maintained reputations of prominent community members. The pattern suggested that the Bishop family's disappearance was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader system of social control that relied on the elimination of threats to the established order. Dr. Kellner's documentation of these other cases revealed striking similarities in the circumstances surrounding the disappearances, including the sudden departure of key witnesses and the rapid disposal of property through mysterious buyers. These other cases had attracted less attention than the Bishop family disappearance because the missing families had been less prominent in the community, but the pattern of similarities suggested that the same individuals or organizations had been responsible for multiple eliminations. The systematic nature of these disappearances indicated a level of organization and planning that went far beyond spontaneous responses to individual threats. Dr. Kellner's research was curtailed in 1968, when his access to key archival materials was unexpectedly restricted by administrative decisions at several institutions that had previously been cooperative. His final report, submitted to the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1969, concluded that while he had found substantial evidence to support the Bishop family's claims about the existence of conspiratorial networks among Salem's elite families, the full extent of these activities would likely never be known due to the systematic destruction of incriminating evidence over the intervening decades. The termination of Dr. Kellner's research reflected the continued sensitivity of the historical issues he had been investigating and suggested that the networks Catherine Bishop had discovered might have retained enough influence to protect themselves against academic investigation. The researchers' sudden loss of access to crucial materials indicated that individuals with significant institutional power had decided that his work posed unacceptable risks to interests that remained active. The mystery of the Bishop family's fate took an unexpected turn in 1967 when an elderly woman named Sarah Patterson contacted Dr. Kellner claiming to be Catherine Bishop's great-niece. Patterson, who had been raised by relatives in Maine after losing her parents early in life, had recently inherited a trunk of family documents that included letters from Catherine Bishop dated as late as 1905. Patterson's emergence as a family connection had occurred through her own genealogical research, which had led her to discover references to the Bishop family in materials left by her adoptive family. Her investigation into her own background had revealed that her mother had been related to Catherine Bishop, though this connection had never been disclosed to her during her upbringing. The letters from Catherine described a life of deliberate isolation in a cabin located in the woods of northern New Hampshire, approximately 20 miles from the nearest town. Catherine wrote of maintaining a garden and supporting herself through occasional sales of handwoven textiles, while continuing her genealogical research in secret. The letters made no mention of other family members, suggesting that Catherine had either become separated from them during their escape or had been the only survivor of whatever crisis had prompted their disappearance. More intriguingly, Catherine's later letters described ongoing efforts to document the historical conspiracies she had uncovered in Salem, with the intention of eventually publishing her findings when it became safe to do so. She wrote of maintaining extensive files of evidence that she hoped would someday allow for the exposure of the truth about Salem's hidden history and the fate of families like her own, who had been eliminated for threatening that secrecy. Catherine's correspondence with her great-niece revealed a woman who had maintained her intellectual interests and research activities despite the isolation and hardship of her new circumstances. Her letters described continuing work on genealogical projects and her efforts to document the broader patterns of social control that she had discovered in Salem. She expressed hope that future researchers would be able to use her materials to expose the truth about the network of elite families that had controlled the community for centuries. Dr. Kellner's attempts to locate the remote cabin described in Catherine's letters were unsuccessful, though local records in northern New Hampshire contained references to a reclusive woman who had lived in the area during the early 1900s and was remembered for her unusual knowledge of historical matters. This individual, known locally as Miss Catherine, had reportedly died during the severe winter of 1908, leaving behind a cabin filled with papers and books that were assumed to be of little value and were subsequently destroyed. The local descriptions of Miss Catherine matched Catherine Bishop in several significant details, including her apparent education and her interest in historical research. Residents who had encountered her described a woman who seemed out of place in the remote rural setting, with mannerisms and speech patterns that suggested a background in educated, urban society. The timing of Miss Catherine's death coincided with the cessation of the financial transfers that Dr. Kellner had discovered in his research, supporting the theory that the mysterious woman had indeed been Catherine Bishop. The destruction of her papers after her death had eliminated what might have been crucial evidence about the Bishop family's fate and the historical conspiracies they had uncovered. The final chapter in the investigation of the Bishop family disappearance began in 1968, when the mansion on Chestnut Street was sold once again, this time to a developer who planned to convert it into apartments. The sale had been prompted by the decision of the anonymous owners to finally dispose of the property after decades of maintaining it without occupancy or apparent purpose. During the preparation for this conversion, workers discovered an additional cache of hidden documents that had been sealed behind a false wall in the basement. These materials included what appeared to be copies of the most sensitive historical documents that Catherine Bishop had uncovered in her research, along with detailed plans for the family's disappearance and cryptic references to a final contingency that would ensure their story eventually came to light. The basement hiding place was more sophisticated than the hidden room behind the library, suggesting that it had been designed specifically to preserve materials for future discovery. The documents had been carefully wrapped and sealed in waterproof containers, indicating that Catherine had taken extensive precautions to ensure their survival, even under adverse conditions. Among these final documents was a letter addressed to whoever finds this record, in which Catherine Bishop provided a complete account of the circumstances that had forced her family to abandon their lives in Salem. She described a system of social control based on mutual intimidation that had extended throughout New England's elite families for over 2 centuries, and explained how her research had threatened to expose activities that contemporary participants were willing to kill to keep secret. Catherine's final letter included specific instructions for the verification of her claims, with references to documentary evidence that had been hidden in various locations throughout Massachusetts and New Hampshire. She expressed hope that future researchers would be able to piece together the complete truth about what had happened to her family and others who had been eliminated for possessing dangerous knowledge about the past. The letter revealed that the Bishop family's disappearance had been part of a carefully planned strategy designed to preserve both their lives and their evidence while creating the possibility for eventual exposure of the truth. Catherine described a complex arrangement involving multiple hiding places for documents, financial provisions for extended exile, and contingency plans for communicating their story to future investigators. The discovery of these final documents prompted one last attempt to verify Catherine Bishop's claims and determine the fate of her family. This investigation, conducted by a team of researchers from several New England universities, was undertaken in 1969 but was never completed due to budget restrictions and institutional concerns about the potential legal implications of the research. The preliminary findings, which were never formally published, reportedly confirmed many of Catherine's assertions about the existence of conspiratorial networks among prominent families, but stopped short of identifying specific individuals or providing details about contemporary activities. The researchers involved in the project were bound by confidentiality agreements that prevented them from discussing their work, suggesting that the investigation had uncovered information that remained sensitive decades after the original events. Today, more than 60 years after the discovery of the hidden documents, the true fate of the Bishop family remains unknown. The mansion on Chestnut Street stands empty once again, having been abandoned by the developer after construction crews reported experiencing unexplained difficulties during the renovation work. Local authorities eventually condemned the building as structurally unsafe, though engineering reports found no evidence of significant damage or deterioration that would justify such action. The documents discovered in the mansion's hidden rooms were eventually transferred to the Massachusetts State Archives, where they remain under restricted access due to ongoing legal concerns about their contents. Researchers who have been granted permission to examine these materials report that they provide a disturbing picture of social control mechanisms that may have continued to operate in various forms well into the 20th century, though the specific details of these activities remain classified. Access to the Bishop family materials is controlled through a complex approval process that requires demonstration of legitimate academic purpose and agreement to strict limitations on the publication of findings. The few researchers who have been granted access report that the materials confirm the existence of historical conspiracies involving prominent New England families, but the specific details of these activities and their contemporary implications remain protected by legal and institutional barriers. What is known with certainty is that the Bishop family's disappearance was not the isolated incident it initially appeared to be, but part of a broader pattern of elimination that targeted individuals who possessed knowledge that threatened the carefully maintained historical narratives of New England's elite families. The systematic nature of these eliminations and the sophisticated methods used to conceal them suggest a level of organization and resources that extended far beyond what any single family could have commanded. Whether any members of the Bishop family survived their disappearance and whether Catherine Bishop's hope for eventual exposure of the truth will ever be fulfilled remains a question that may never be answered. The forces that compelled their departure from Salem appear to have retained enough power to suppress investigation of their fate for over a century, suggesting that the secrets they uncovered remain dangerous to individuals or institutions with continuing influence. The silence that surrounds their fate continues to echo through the empty rooms of their ancestral home, a reminder that some secrets are protected by forces that transcend the grave. The Bishop Mansion stands as a monument to the power of hidden knowledge and the lengths to which certain individuals will go to protect themselves from the consequences of historical truth. In the end, the family's disappearance serves as a warning about the dangers faced by those who seek to illuminate the darker corners of the past and the persistence of systems designed to ensure that some stories are never told.